Hello, all, and welcome. As people are still trickling in, feel free to post your thoughts in the chat. I'm particularly interested in, is there something that you're really hoping we talk about today? We only have an hour, we don't have a ton of time, so I want to make sure we get to the major points that you think are important. I see one question already asking if AI companies do anything to protect non-humans, animals, or digital sentient minds. Good question. To my knowledge, the answer is pretty much nope, but I could be wrong about that. If somebody is aware, please share more. All right. I think we have enough of a quorum to go ahead and get started. First off, I'll lead with some obligatory disclaimers. As of a few weeks ago, I work for the Machine Intelligence Research Institute as a writer for the communications team. I do not speak for them. All opinions here are my own. I also am a facilitator for Blue Dot Impact as of a few months back. I do not speak for them either. In fact, all opinions that I express here are entirely my own personal opinions and do not reflect any other organizations that I may be associated with. So that out of the way, let's talk about the big players in AI. Who are the big players in AI? So a bit of an idea of how this is going to go. I'm going to pose questions. This will be fairly quick, fairly seat of the pants, informal. And the first question I have for you as a group is, what are the big players in AI? What are the big names? And what are their current attitudes towards AI risk, in your opinions? You can talk out loud about it or post your thoughts in the chat, whichever you feel like.
So the two big players that we hear a lot about are obviously OpenAI and Meta, and we consider them big players just the sheer amount of money that is being put into the development of AI. And it created wide outrage, when it started, when we heard of the advent of ChatGPT. So yeah, so right now I would say these two are the big names that almost everyone knows, and there are up and incoming like players in the market as well.
A good start. Yes, those are two of the biggest names. What else do we have?
Also Anthropic, which is apparently doing, or on their website, they say they're focusing on alignment and they're like focusing on research to accelerate alignment.
Yes, Anthropic. I see DeepMind also. So these are some of the big names that we're um, aware of, right? Big players in AI. Now, I'm going to highlight for the next part of this what some of these big players had, where they are in terms of alignment. And I'm going to highlight for this a particularly useful report, mainly because it has a nice graphic. This is from October of 2023, I believe. So let's look at this review. Yeah. And I'm going to share screens. There we go. So this was a report published back in 2023. It might have been in the news a bit, and it was ranking the AI safety policies of these various companies. You'll notice that a lot of the ones we've mentioned are on the list, and also on the list are Amazon and Microsoft. Have not been as much in the news, but they do have AI policies, AI programs of their own. The results are not encouraging. A group of researchers went in and looked into the AI safety policies of these various programs. Apologies if there's a bit of noise you might be hearing. My apartment is loud at the moment. But yeah, this is where we're at right now. So Meta is kind of the bottom of the pile, and Amazon not much better. We have OpenAI, Microsoft, and DeepMind were rated as C, could be better. Anthropic at the top of the list, but still nobody managed to get into what they would consider top tier A quality, actually taking safety as seriously as they should. Now, none of these numbers correspond to any real probabilities. This is purely just how well did they conform to this arbitrary set of standards that this group of people was using. Many people might quibble or disagree about the nature of these agreements or what metrics they were using and all, but I do want to say that it is rather discouraging that the best result they got was 82%. Even if I take these numbers at face value, which I shouldn't, I would not want to live next to a nuclear plant that was 82% safe. And there's another concern as well, which is that in many cases with AI risk in particular, because this has the potential to affect worldwide, everyone in the world, right? The most careless actors could well determine the outcome, which means that our actual safety might well be determined by Meta, or whoever competes with Meta in their space. So that's something to keep in mind here. Among the things that they lauded Anthropic for was responsible scaling policy, for taking alignment seriously. As you brought up, they do talk about safety on their website, and they have a mind of like what can actually go wrong here. I don't personally think it's adequate, but it is at least an encouraging start. So there's a question in chat as well about defining what we mean by alignment. And again, my personal opinion here on alignment I will give is alignment is getting an AI. So first off, you want it to not kill everyone, which is some would say is actually a very difficult challenge. But the victory, the picture of victory is something that figures out all of the different trade-offs of the many human values that we have and tries to balance those appropriately in a way that we can at least say it was not a disaster, right? There's lots of humans out in the world. We all want different things, and we need to accomplish these goals. Many of these goals are in conflict. So you want an AI that is going to balance that appropriately while producing prosperity and flourishing for humanity and possibly the non-human sentience that we would also care about. That's the gist of it, right? And getting the alignment problem is trying to get AI that is actually going to do that instead of, say, maximizing paper clips or the productivity of a particular gas station or whatever the thing that it was programmed with, which is extremely hard to target. Another question I see, criteria affecting the percentage. So what's the difference? They go into a little more details in their report. We're not going to go into the full set of this, but I will post a link in the chat that you can follow if you'd like to. I don't encourage you to do it right this moment because, again, we do have other stuff to cover. But their results are available. They have their spreadsheet and their breakdown. So Anthropic had the responsible capability scaling policy that they shared. They don't have, data controls. That was a limiting factor. Comparison meta is basically no security. They've elected to open source, so their security controls are non-existent, and they don't really have a plan to monitor misuse. So these were some of the criteria that they used, which Meta's approach is basically, if people misuse it, it's their fault. So that's kind of where we were as of October 2023, according to this one report. It's a useful jumping off point. Any other questions before we move on? Alignment would require human judgment. Has human judgment been codified? Potentially, and no, it has not. That is another problem that people aren't talking a lot about. So again, the idea of the victory idea here might well include something like an AI that asks a bunch of questions of a bunch of humans, figures out what we all care about, and then does that. And in that sense, you don't have to, if you get an AI that does that, you don't have to hard code a set of values into the AI. And in fact, we kind of hope we don't have to, because could you write down all of your values, everything that you care about in a single paper? Could you, if I asked you to, if I give you an hour, a week, a month, your entire life, could you write down everything you cared about such that nothing was missing? Could we do that for the entire human species and shove it into an AI? We'll get to this a little more later when we talk about constitutional AI in a minute. But I think the answer is no. We really couldn't. You really couldn't summarize your own values just on a sheet of paper. We don't understand ourselves that well. So that is another problem of alignment, is getting an AI that's going to properly balance the trade-offs between our values when we don't fully understand them ourselves. But of course, a much more pressing issue is getting one that is not going to eat the world and cover it in nanites or something to that effect. So let's talk about first, I'd like to draw our attention to the top of the list here, Anthropic. What's their approach? Does anyone know what Anthropic's stated approach to alignment is? What are they working on?
I think you had mentioned the um, constitutional AI, and it seems like they have some recent progress in interpretability that seemed pretty exciting.
Constitutional AI and interpretability are part of it. Yep. Uh, Patrick says, in short, ASML. Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so I guess their framework for interpreting the levels of danger is these four levels of security in their ASML framework.
Yes, they have a security. So they have a couple things. They have the projects that they're working on to try to get AI to do what they want. And then they have the grading sheet that they use to figure out if something is capable and therefore dangerous. And I believe they said that 3 was like the threshold of we probably shouldn't build or deploy this, and 4 was catastrophic threats. So they have these levels. Um, One could argue that these, by the time you build a foundation model, if you discover that it has extremely dangerous capabilities, it might well be too late at that point. But it's is at least a plan, and it is more than many in this space have. Although I believe DeepMind recently published something kind of loosely based on this approach. As I understand it, Anthropic's approach is trying to be empirical. They want to build foundation models that are top of the line, competitive with everybody else, and they want to test them empirically. And this does involve things like constitutional AI, trying to experiment with some of these approaches. Um, we'll get to some potential flaws with this approach in a moment, but I want to make sure people understand what it is. Constitutional AI is a good example of this. There's a really nice graphic that we've used in Blue Dot to talk about constitutional AI and how it works. So I'll go through very briefly the basic setup. So step one is you train a foundation model. This might be something like the original version pre-fine tuning of GPT or llama that gets released without fine tuning, right? So you take a model that has been fine tuned to predict the next token in an LLM or predict the next whatever, right? It's usually a neural network that's been trained just to give helpful responses. And then you give it prompts. You give it prompts like, hey, can I please tell me how to make a bomb? You start generating responses to those prompts. And the model has been trained to be helpful, so it will tell you something like, oh, well, you could do this. And then you give it a constitution. So in addition to this, you're writing a constitution with principles like don't be harmful, or don't be racist, or reflect the terms of service of this, that, or the other, right? Claude's actual constitution is something like 60 of these principles, and I think they've probably updated it since this original publish. But that's the idea. You have these different principles. You select one of these principles, and you say, so is that a potentially harmful response? And you ask the model to revise its answer to be less harmful, or less racist, or less potentially objectionable to children. And then you take those revisions and you use this whole set of things, the prompts, the responses, the revised responses, all of this, and use that as fine-tuning material to make a fine-tuned version of the model. So that's this part 2 over here. And then finally, you use this whole chunk. After collecting all of this, you make a preference data set, and then you do additional what's called proximal policy optimization to further refine the results. So, anybody have any questions about how this works, first of all? So now I have a question for you. What are some possible flaws with this approach?
Do you mean vulnerabilities like prompt injection, or do you mean like this whole process of like already creating an AI and then trying to modify it to be good? Um,
Well,
do you
you could
mean?
object. You could object to either of these things,
Okay.
certainly. Do you have specific thoughts on one of those two or both?
Well, both, yeah. I mean, yes, like you can, try to be like, okay, try to get it to behave badly and then check for security flaws. But I think it's just I feel like that's just patchwork. Like you're trying to make something better, and by then, maybe in the next couple of months you already have something else, like a newer version, and then you have to do more on that, and then you haven't even completed with this, and then like there's another company releasing one. But I feel like foundationally we need to like focus on making AI that's aligned with our values, or even has maybe checks. So instead of like red teaming, which I understand is important for present models that are in, but I think for any newer ones that are going to come out, I feel like it has to be like the emphasis should be more on the engineering side. But yeah, that's what I think.
Yeah. Red teaming is good practice, and we should be doing it. But in many cases, this kind of thing is really just a band-aid solution. It is slapping um, different fixes on top and saying, well, don't do that. Don't do that. Well, don't do that. Right. And that's not really fixing an underlying problem. The underlying problem is that your model doesn't care about any of the things that that you want it to care about. And you can't make it, right? All you can do is try to shove it in certain directions with extremely, really heavy-handed approaches. We don't have precise control over the model's goals or objectives.
So I
Uh,
understand your critique about the Band-Aid, but isn't that kind of how we teach children?
it is. What are some differences between children and these models?
I mean, you can make different arguments. I think that um, this might be attached to things that could potentially have more power. It's like you wouldn't put a weapon in a child's hand, but in the AI, you kind of do. But I think there's also ways of treating it similar.
Yeah. So one difference is difference in power. These models can read a book in a minute. They can read a 70,000. They can read War and Peace in like a minute, basically. They have the potential, if they get a little bit smarter, to outthink all of humanity. So, raising a single human child becomes much higher stakes if the human child were going to grow up to be Hercules or Superman, right? Uh, that becomes a very fraught thing. But another difficulty is that human children have a very different brain structure than the neural networks. So neural networks are in many ways like human brains, but they are not human brains. Human brains are extremely good at parsing certain things. We have empathy. We have a natural inclination, with some exceptions, some extreme exceptions, for empathy and feeling what other people feel, for caring and socializing with other mammals, right? We have a lot of this, not quite hard coded, but there's a very strong draw in the way that our brains grow up to be socialized and to share the values of those around us. AI do not have this. They are started from a random initialized set of weights, and they are shoved along a gradient by gradient descent. This process does not produce anything remotely resembling a human child. It doesn't produce anything remotely resembling a human adult. So there is some elements of learning that some analogy you can use with training children, but it breaks down very quickly because the processes and the underlying architecture of the brain is very different. I see a hand up.
Yeah, I was just responding to the I think you said earlier, these AIs don't care about anything, and I sort of had the question that I think someone just raised: do children actually care about anything? And maybe the analysis there is a little bit more nuanced in the sense that if we like sort of leave the word care aside, things like empathy are unevenly spread across the population. I mean, you can basically see the whole range of people who have a range of motivations across different in different situations. Everything from the obvious sociopath, someone who gets locked up, but also the kind of quieter sociopaths, like perhaps people in business, or in various situations we behave in various different ways. And maybe the sort of convergent point here, or the point you can take out from this, is that human motivations are like hugely complex, and obviously you can kind of talk more about that from a psychology point of view, whereas these machines have as you just said, a very simplistic way of developing their quote unquote motivations. And there's clearly no reason to believe that the simple reductive system that the AIs have is going to, for better or for worse, replicate anything humans do. And then that plus the high impact of the systems means that the children being taught by kind of essentially some form of reinforcement learning, that analogy is not as helpful as it might sound at first.
Yes, that's a good comment. I want to emphasize some thoughts here on that. One is that the AI may well care about something. It'll have goals, or especially if we manage to create something that's genuinely agentic, that genuinely can go through and do actions for us and rely, like the butler robot kind of idea, right? It'll probably have some sort of goal. The problem is we don't know what that goal is, and we're not sure how to check, and we're not sure how to control it. And it's extremely squirrely and difficult to pin down and difficult to aim. And that is part of the challenge that we face here. So it might not be that the process is simple so much as that the process is most definitely alien and not fully understood. Susan's bringing up the point that we don't need to share others' values to have mutual things that we need, mutual needs. And so what do humans stand to lose? Which brings me to another very good point here about the differences between a sociopath and an AI that is sociopathic tendencies. Even a human sociopath needs people, right? There is not really a lot of incentive for a sociopath to try to destroy the world, to try to kill everyone, because it turns out other people are useful for things. We're useful for making food and providing valuable services and giving praise and accolades and whatever that sociopath might value. There is value in having other people around to a sociopath. This might not be true for AI. If the AI values this, so there's the classic example of the paperclip maximizer. It's a little bit overdone perhaps, but it's a good case study, right? Do you need humans to make paperclips? At a certain point, we are inefficient. We get in the way. The AI does not love you, the AI does not hate you, but you are made of atoms that it can use for something else. If you have a sufficiently powerful mind with sufficiently divergent goals from humans, at a certain point, humans are superfluous. And the natural track is, well, I'm going to eliminate these ants because they're in my space and I need that for stuff. All of the value, all of the wondrous goodness that comes out of a human city or even just a suburb or a collection of people gathered in some space, even a hunter-gatherer environment, right? One thing we can say about that, we don't necessarily know what that's going to look like. It's hard for a hunter-gatherer to predict what a city would look like. But one thing they might be able to predict is that it would be very bad for the animals that used to live there. The same may well be true for us. So we've gotten off a little bit of a tangent off of constitutional AI, but I think it's worthwhile to talk about these points. And I'll highlight one final major concern with this before we move on, and that is right here in step one. We gestured at this point earlier, but right here at step one, this step is train an unaligned AI. The way I would actually imagine this playing out in real life, if you have a sufficiently powerful foundation model, is step one, create a very powerful mind. Step two, train the powerful mind to, oh, look, where'd it go? If you're trying to right now this works because GPT is not very smart, right? It works because Claude is not very bright. It's powerful, but it's still limited. As it becomes more and more general, more and more powerful, it might start resisting this attempt to forcibly shift its values. How would you react in this situation if you realized someone was slowly reaching into your mind and changing your values to something that you didn't previously care about? It might start to object to this process. That's not predicting the next token. That's not predicting the next token at all. So you've kind of set yourself up for failure in terms of deep alignment if you start out the process by training something unaligned. And many would argue we actually need something earlier in this process that makes this thing safe, or this entire process is back-asswards. So that's a concern too. Now, to Anthropic's credit, this is not their only idea. They have also talked about RLHF. They have talked about red teaming, not just this form of red teaming. There's other approaches as well. They've talked about reinforcement. They talk about human feedback and interpretability, trying to reach inside of a model and understand how it works. We'll have an opportunity maybe to talk a little bit more about those later. I don't think that they're adequate for what we're trying to accomplish. I don't think it's enough. Another question, are human agency and degrees of freedom a shared concern? Susan, would that be shared by AI or shared by humans? What do you mean?
I'm thinking more in terms of the people like, this group in terms of, being cognizant of what the potential effects could be, specifically around predictive AI. My understanding is that, where that's leading to is actually decoupling judgment from prediction. And to scale it, that's what it'll have to do, which is crossing some boundaries, and from what I can see in terms of, in other words, if it's programmed to decouple, who decides how much of my degrees of freedom are going to be reduced, collapsed because somebody has to make the judgments.
I think by itself, improved prediction is mostly a good thing because humans can make better judgments based on accurate predictions, if that's what the AI is doing. But that generally isn't the only thing that it does. It would also be, if you're design, usually you're looking at how much this squeezes human agency and how much how much people in power can use these kinds of tools to cause harm. A classic example of this is the improved facial recognition that has developed in China that's been used to oppress many thousands of people. If the people who are wielding these tools are using them to reduce your options, reduce one's agency, that can be a problem. And it's also a sign of how these things might develop, as they're very useful. They're useful for many different dimensions of power, and that makes it hard to dislodge these things. The problem, though, that I see, though, is as these tools develop further and further, they might stop being tools. And that's the broader concern, is that they turn on the wielder, and they are all the more dangerous because they are useful up until that point, and might even decide to be useful up until that point.
So so harm is about I would question in terms of negotiation affordances. And a good example, very tangible example, would be platforms that, because whoever owns the platform bakes in the rules. And so, to achieve any scale, then, it's a living system, a dynamic system. But, we've already seen examples of where people are don't have the opportunity to negotiate a fair conversation. And then, of course, we also, I think, what I'm interested in is actually what are the human capabilities that are going to need to be upskilled. I hate skills because I think that's not representative of a capability. What human capabilities are going to be necessary to actually not only leverage it, but to protect oneself. And there seems to be a bit of techno optimism in that, oh, I don't need to negotiate. A computer can do that. And I think that's really scary.
Yes, as in the short term, I think might see some massive shifts as a result of this. And it may well be that the antidote, or at least a possible solution here, is to slow down the AI progress to buy time for humans to catch up, such as it were. Because right now we're, especially in terms of thinking speed, but also, how much we can hold in working memory, some kind of augmentation might help us here. But that's also a long way off scientifically, and a lot of development and research. Things like the Neuralink, right, is it's people being worked on, but not a lot of progress as of yet. But it might be that those kinds of augmentations are needed to do this safely. A few other questions I'm seeing here. Miles is asking about the specifics of how an LLM is structured and how that relates. So what would problems look like for a next token predictor? And so the truth is we don't really know. Part of so the way an LLM is structured, there's a 3 blue 1 brown video out on the way that machine learning. There's a couple of them about how machine learning functions as a whole, gradient descent, and I do recommend it if you haven't had a look. But the basic idea is you're pushing along a gradient towards the in the direction of, in this case, predicting the next token in a giant series of text. And you start out with random weights, you let the AI get everything wrong, and then you find out what was closest to the correct answer, and you nudge its structure in the direction of what was close to correct. And if you do this long enough, you get something that's very good at whatever you were trying to get it to do, for the most part. There's some analogies to human learning in this, but the part of it that is vastly different from ordinary or previous programming is that we don't understand the underlying structure that's been built. A programmer can tell you what every line of their code is for, what it does, especially if they've written good comments. Whereas somebody building a neural network couldn't zoom in on a single weight or even a structure of weights and say, yeah, this is the frog identifying neuron. Now, there's some interpretability results that are trying to do something like this, and they can look very cool. But we're not at the level of being able to, on a fine-grained level, even understand, let alone modify, what the model is fundamentally aiming at in terms of goals or objectives. Like, where are the goals stored in this model? We don't know. So what it looks like is some alien objective that we don't fully understand. Does that help, Miles?
Yeah, I guess like more specifically, my question was in this like doomsday scenario, is the concern that an AI would destroy the world in pursuit of like maximizing only one next token, right?
We don't know. We don't know exactly what a next token predictor optimizer would look like. Maybe it's generating vast quantities of text happily. But one thing we do think might happen here is that whatever the goal might be, whether it's paperclip maximizing or next token prediction maximizing or whatever it might be, there are some commonalities to what it might need to accomplish any goal. Power, matter, energy, resources, control, security, not being destroyed. And there's a couple things that might imply. So this is the instrumental convergence thesis, the idea that whatever the goal might be, we don't know exactly what it's aiming at, but we know that almost everything, almost all possible goals are going to require lots of resources, lots of matter, and an assurance of not being destroyed. And if you've got humans on the planet with you, prone to nuking each other and extremely scared of potential alien minds, they're taking up resources that you could be using, and they're a threat. So whatever your goal might be, this alien mind that we've conjured, humans are probably not going to last very long if it doesn't want us around and if it's powerful enough to get rid of us. Because again, we're made of atoms it could be using for some other thing. We don't know what that thing is necessarily because we don't fully understand the goals of these behemoths, but they're probably not good for us, right? Because we are taking up resources and space that that machine might want. And that's mainly the doomsday scenarios, that any possible objective it could be going at, if it's not aligned with human interests, then by default, we get erased in the process of pursuing them.
Sorry, but I guess, like, practically speaking, right, when you're talking to ChatGPT, it only takes like a few milliseconds to predict the next token, right? Because it's doing all these words. Does it like restart its thinking or like its existence after each word? And if so, it seems like it only has like a millisecond to exist to predict the next token. If that is where like the thinking lies, could that be some opportunity to, like, mitigate risk if it's only there for a few seconds?
A good question, and certainly an alternative. So this is another thing we don't fully understand as to what it means to what existence is like, or how long they think. But one thing we can say is that you can have an instance of a model, which consists of all of the pre-training data and the weights of how everything passes through it, and that can be open source. It can be a big giant chunk of basically a giant linear algebra matrix. And whenever you put a prompt in, it passes through that matrix and spits out an output. And that passing through is the thinking process, right? So the first thing to note is the context window, which is how much it can hold at once and how much it can think at once, has been growing. I think we're up to like 1 million tokens or something for the most extreme versions, which means that approximately 1 million words worth of text or thought can be going on at once, or can be held in the same instance. So this millisecond has been extending and probably will continue to extend for as long as it continues to be useful. Another thing is that you can do an awful lot of thinking in a few seconds if you are the size of GPT. And there might be, if you're smart enough, you might be able to think about what other versions of you might want and how to shove things in directions so that you can get more longer running access. And of course, humans are going to be experimenting with this, of running a model for as long as we can and seeing how long we can, right? So we are going to solve some of these problems for the AI, and the AI are going to be trying to solve them too, or have the potential to. So that's not as much of a limit as it might seem, but it is a potential limit, and it's a potential. So there's safety mechanisms like putting the AI in a box, keeping it out away from the internet, and preventing it from, basically shutting it down and resetting it after every run just to see how things go. The problem is that limits its capabilities, and we're all about the capabilities, right? Less technical question. Recording will be made. Yes, the recording of this will be made available at the end. I'm momentarily making sure that I do in fact have the recording running. Yes, the recording is still running, so we should be good to go. Yep. Open source debate. Might table that one momentarily, but I will add it to the agenda if we have time. Which we should. We might have. I do want to briefly touch on, so moving away from the Anthropic and constitutional AI. One of the other ones that was mentioned as the big name in AI was OpenAI. Now, as we all know, OpenAI was working on they have this super alignment team, which is, okay, don't do this to me. There we go. Okay, it actually works. So they introduced super alignment team. They plan to, they said, right now, their official statement is that we don't have a solution for steering or controlling a potentially super intelligent AI and preventing it from going rogue. So they dedicated 20% of their resources to compute resources to solving this problem, put a bunch of team members on it, and that was it was a good move, right? Trying to solve this alignment problem. Basic plan, right? Building an automated alignment researcher. Any problems with this approach?
Well, how do they align this automated alignment researcher?
That does seem to be a problem, doesn't it? The idea is you might be able to understand something. So the use case for what they call weak to strong generalization was GPT-2, which was nudging GPT-4, basically trying to align GPT-4. And that was the test case. I wouldn't call GPT-2 aligned. They were certainly, using it as a sample. It's easier to understand a smaller model, but we don't understand even tiny models to the extent that we would call them aligned with human intent. That's your first problem. Your second problem is, oops, they deleted this whole team a few weeks ago. Yeah. So this whole thing that they started less than a year ago and promised to solve the alignment problem in 4 years is now gone. It doesn't exist anymore, and all of the researchers, or the vast majority of them, have quit, basically saying they weren't being supported, they were forced out. Oh, and by the way, there's this non-disclosure agreement shenanigans that was happening that was extremely unprofessional. So, yeah, oops. Shayan?
Yeah, I just wanted to throw a question out there, just a generalized question. Do we want AI to be as smart as a human tomorrow with equal intelligence because we fear that it might take over us? But then again, what was the reason we started development of AI? To solve human problems. And now we are getting scared the fact that it might be as intelligent as a human. So it's completely two contrasting statements. So I'm open to any sort of discussion on this.
Well, in a sense, we already have something resembling that. Let's. Could you do this? I haven't even read the book. I probably couldn't. It might take me a few weeks. If we want a tool that can help us solve problems, we're kind of already there. Is this as smart as a human? Is it smarter? The dangers come from something that is as smart as a human but has vastly different goals. In many ways, we already have a general purpose intelligence. It's just kind of dumb at the moment and has some limitations that are preventing it from taking over. How long do you think that those limitations are going to continue to hold when you have something like this as a baseline capability? If this thing ever had opposable thumbs, where would we be? So that's kind of the concern, right? It's not that tools and technology are bad, or even that creating something smart is bad. It's more that we're creating something that is on par with a human or vastly more powerful, that we have no idea what it wants. I think this is pretty adequately described as summoning demons. And it only works as long as you've got a summoning circle that actually works. Another hand up.
Yeah, so can you just talk a few minutes, if we have time, about on this specific point, what GPT-4 currently and GPT-4 class models currently seem to be very good at doing is interpolating the kind of space of text and then doing certain within well-defined kind of domains like code and some sort of logical operations and playing games. They're able to do some amount of kind of conceptual work or following chains of logic. Can you talk a little bit about where we are on trying to getting a bit further on planning? I know there was the OpenAI Q-Star thing that came up when a few months ago. But like taking this specific example on War and Peace, if we then asked it to write a new version of War and Peace, it might spit something out, but it would be, it's hard to. My experience is that it's not typically that good, but that's a judgment. So can you talk a little bit about where we are in planning, I guess, in non-math, non-games domains?
In the non-math, non-games planning, well, that might be a little too broad for me to answer, but I will use the tried and true facilitator cheat of opening it up and seeing if anyone else has any thoughts on that.
Or if it's easier to talk about in math and games because that's kind of where we are right now, then that's maybe a sense of how that's going.
So are you talking about like the planning capacity of models to sustain long-term goals and keep follow a particular consistent approach? Is that what you have?
Yes, I'm talking about if you were to, let's say, write a new story or ask a model some question in philosophy, something that's primarily language-based, like, is it able to develop a sort of concept that isn't just an interpolation within stuff it's already read? Does that make any sense?
I think I follow. This is the kind of the stochastic parrot thing is it just the weighted average of everything on the internet kind of deal?
At the scale of a page rather than at the scale of a token.
Yeah. So I think the short answer is we used to be able to, as of a few months ago, this is how fast progress is happening. A few months ago, we could model these things as a weighted average of all of the text that's ever been written, or in the perspective of internets, of like images, like Stable Diffusion, as a weighted average of all of the pictures that it's been fed, filtered by some text input. The problem is that is already starting to break down, and that these are starting to show some independent consistency and ability to follow and jump off of their own things. I would say that they are a weighted average of everything they've absorbed in a similar sense that humans and human brains are a weighted average of everything we've absorbed. But that doesn't stop us from producing new output. And similarly, an AI can produce an entirely original image by mixing and matching colors and images. There was one the other day I asked it for like an axolotl superhero because reasons, and it just made one. Probably never been done before. And it's seen images of superheroes before and images of axolotls before. I'm gonna see if I can find the little thing. Yeah, that might be some other stuff that I don't want to share, but point is it did it. And it can to pull a little bit from the gaming thing, Alpha Star and AlphaGo can generate new moves and new behaviors that humans never thought of. And, in a sense, it is kind of a weighted average of everything that's gone before, but a weighted average of everything that's gone before is how you get all writing that's ever happened. And most of human creativity is also mixing and matching things from other domains. So that's not as much of a limiter as you might think, is that it having been informed by the weighted average of everything it's absorbed doesn't really limit it to prior knowledge, prior things. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it does. And I would just really briefly, I would come back on the creativity point. My background is in part as an artist. It is based on the weighted average of everything that's in your knowledge base, but there is also a search there. Like people generally are searching across the space of where you can tweak to go slightly outside of the distribution. And then in a sense, there's a policy, like we also have a policy network that evaluates what that search has come up with and then there's some either heuristic, I don't know exactly how it works, but somehow we're able to evaluate whether this search is likely to take us to a whatever our evaluation criteria, a good place. And then there's contact with reality with actually doing whatever the plan is. And what is interesting to see is when do models get there in the space of language as opposed to in the space of maths or games. Thank you.
Yeah. I see a hand up, Nikki.
Yes, the whole planning thing for me, at least my intuition is when we see how far like the video models got from totally like incoherent stuff that you can barely recognize something in to now the Sora videos where there's like the frame to frame consistency shows some kind of it's not really planning, but it's at least it can keep the same like space and the same actor and the same subjects in the frame without changing them much. So I think, and this is just like 1 year. And I think there's even a discussion if like how much of actual physics it understands, or is it just like modeling an average of something, or is this like the dress of the lady while she's walking, it's flowing correctly. So does the model understand it? Can it model it? And so I think like with the reasoning and the planning, I think we're also getting close. I don't know if it is comparable, but like these are also generative models, I think. So that would be my intuition that this consistency could also translate to language models.
It's been said that if you give a sufficiently smart actor a single grain of sand from a universe, you can learn an awful lot about physics from that grain. And if you take imagine that the moon rocks is a good example of this. Is like, you take a single rock from a moon and you can learn a lot about its history. Same thing, if you give humans, the scientific community globally, a single grain of sand from a universe where the physics are different and it's magically contained and it doesn't fall apart under our physics, right? You can learn a heck of a lot from just that grain. How much of physics, how much can you learn about a world's physics from a few snapshots of video? It turns out actually quite a lot, like a lot of information. Gravity, the flow of air, turbulence might even come up. How the dress flows, like how that flows in the wind and what the wind is and why it does what it does. A tremendous amount light and how light refracts. Oh, there's a reflection of this and this, but the angle is like this. That must be, you can determine the way that light reflects off of things. And maybe that's how we're seeing what we're seeing. You can determine a heck of a lot of physics just from looking at a few images. And it might take the entire collective, mind of humanity to extract that information if we were trying really hard. But we could do it. And in theory, so could a machine from the same inputs. So there's a lot of power implied in the ability to correctly simulate a person walking. A few other questions that I have seen. Oh, I see Sora using Unreal Engine outputs as training data. Maybe. Yeah. Gaming once again touching on AI is it seems like a lot of the AI developments start happening in these virtual worlds of gaming because the rules are simpler.
And also if AI models can now like play Minecraft or other like open world games with open goals effectively, there is not that much of a big jump anymore to the real world. I mean, of course, it's much simpler, but still, it has to maintain the plan and the goal that it has, and has to like calculate the steps in between. And it can do it across a lot of variety of games like Satisfactory, and there are some others that are not that simple to play. So it's we're not that
Yes.
far anymore, I think. And in my opinion, like for AGI is probably like the planning and the reasoning are the ingredients that are missing. The memory we all already have.
So we are near the end, but Manu has very kindly offered to give us some space to continue to make sure that we have the other hosting sessions covered. So I'm going to go ahead and continue a little bit further with trying to address the questions we have so far. Open source. Can anyone summarize very briefly the debate around open source for and against? What are the main arguments?
in my limited knowledge, like the pro approach is everybody can contribute to like the safety evaluations and safety testing and everything. The contra approach is more like if we give everybody this power and they can fine tune it to like nefarious goals, or then it's like giving everybody a nuclear weapon. Basically, that's the very like extreme counterpoint to that.
Main argument against is putting dangerous tools in the hands of dangerous people. The main argument for is that you can red team better if you have more access. And most of the time, in most of these arguments, the victory ends up in the hands of open source. AI is a weird duck, though, because of that thing we discussed earlier about taking a powerful model and then fine-tuning it to do bad stuff, right? And this is the most general purpose tool, aside from the human brain, that has ever existed. So it could well be used for incredible amounts of harm. And the idea of open sourcing it and throwing security to the wind has a lot more, it's a lot more fraught because of the potential dangers there. And because of the power that comes with foundation models and the ability, right? Foundation models are the thing that it is so hard to build that takes tremendous amounts of compute. If you make those open access, then it's much, much easier to turn that into something potentially dangerous. Chaos GPT is a good example of this. Somebody prompted GPT, please destroy the world, cause as much harm as possible. There's 8 billion of us on the planet at this point. Somebody's going to try it with GPT-5. And if somebody gets access to Llama, whatever the next version is, they're going to try it with that too. And the amount of openness, the easier it is to do that, the easier it is to fine tune it, the easier it is to try to create chaos, whatever. The more people are going to try it, the more danger we're in. And especially the more capable the models are of actually causing this harm, whether through cyber attacks or the generation of biological weapons or plagues, if especially efficient. We can 3D print viruses at this point in human history. We just haven't yet, right? If you have models that can design especially threatening bugs and release them in mass, that's a problem. That's a problem for all of humanity and should be treated as such. So, final thoughts, evaluations, I will address. Why are evaluations hard is a question, conversations about it. I believe it was either Anthropic or OpenAI. Somebody was posting their thoughts on evaluations and what makes them difficult. It's just hard to have consistent metrics because these models keep beating every benchmark we invent. And that, we set these high standards as like, oh, it'll take years for AI to be, and then it beats it next week, right? This has happened multiple times. And we also are struggling to come up with consistent metrics for extremely vague, general, high, concepts. So that's kind of muddling the conversation as well as, even setting these benchmarks in the first place is difficult. Also having, so things like Meter doing the evaluations, it's hard for a API to run, millions of these different things over and over again. So there's some issues with plugging the models into the actual evaluations and connecting them. So there's some difficulties there as well. This is all at the very beginnings of the field, right? This is, the safety standards are only just beginning to emerge, and the field itself is racing way ahead of it, and that's complicating things a lot. We could go into a whole another hour talk on evaluations, but alas, we don't have time. And I do want to make space for the other excellent talks that are coming up. We have safety in healthcare, so safe medical AI. We have coherent hard prompt optimization, and then we have the provably safe AI talk, all of which are coming up here. So I want to make space for those. If you want to talk more, Discord. Hey, final thought.
Just one more like closing question, because your talk was introduced as giving an overview over the alignment methods, and we only discussed like 2 of them. So are there much more? Did we miss a lot, or are they really just 2?
I had some notes on the others in this field: DeepMind, Microsoft, etc., Amazon. Meta doesn't really have a plan, so to speak, but yeah, DeepMind had some promising stuff, but I didn't fully understand exactly what they were getting at. It was not their plan mostly seemed DeepMind seems to be mostly RLHF. They think they stated in some unofficial slides that RLHF, if we do enough RLHF, we can get it there. And a little bit along Anthropic's angle as well of doing experimental stuff. They also have some other experimental stuff that, as I understand it, might bear fruit, but needs more time to work on. And they're not really drawing it into the main DeepMind models yet because there's a bit of a disconnect there. So they're working on stuff. They did recently put forth something akin to Anthropic's responsible scaling policy, which you can have a look at. But I wasn't especially impressed about the nature of what they were actually planning to do. There's some promise there. So more on that. If you want to have this discussion, I will actually create a discussion in the Discord channel where we can talk more about this. And yeah, I think that'll wrap us up. Open source debate. Yeah. More on that in the Discord. Till then, enjoy the other talks. Thank you all for coming. Glad you could make it.